Thanks for being here. In this presentation, I will argue for a ubiquitous principle of wholeness in nature that is illuminated by the dialogue between Buddhism and quantum mechanics, and which can serve as an incentive to reconceptualize humanimal relationships. More specifically, the interconnected state that animates the universe at its most fundamental level is the reign introduced through the relation between Huayan Chinese Buddhism and the ontologically enhanced causal interpretation of quantum mechanics by David Bohm. Both represent particular developments within each school of thought. Huayan is considered as the height of Chinese Buddhism with Chan, the other major Chinese school of Mahayana. Born in the 7th century CE under the Tang dynasty, the school focused exclusively on the study of the Avatamsaka Sutra, which presents an idealistic vision of the universe. The 5 patriarchs, who painstakingly commented on the sutra, however, endeavored to develop a profoundly holistic understanding of the universe, characterized by the interpenetration of all things. That's the key aspect of Huayan philosophy. Their metaphysical and complex analytical writings demonstrated a substantial move from earlier Indian Mahayana, especially of the kind by Nagarjuna, as Huayan philosophy was infused with a distinctively realist and positive Chinese spirit. As for the causal interpretation of quantum mechanics, it was the first alternative interpretation proposed by David Bohm in his seminal paper of 1952. Although he took inspiration from the original insight by Louis de Broglie in 1927. While met with a lukewarm sentiment by the physics community, which discouraged Bohm and led him to abandon his idea in its early days, the interpretation was revived in the late 70s, 80s, at which point Bohm developed a new intuitive framework to make sense of the implications of the causal interpretation, which is the implicate order. This ontological model is inherently holographic and gave Bohm a structure to subsume quantum mechanics, relativity, and even consciousness into a singular philosophical system that for him ought to drive the mathematical formalism developed by physicists. Now that the foundations for both theories have been laid out, I will present the principle of wholeness that naturally emerges out of and is underpinned and propelled by the holism of Bohm and Huayan. This principle would then be used to defend an ethically inclusive revision of humanimal relationships. And finally, a few potential drawbacks will be adduced as a way of getting some perspective on this principle. The holistic thinking developed by Bohm and Huayan, the Huayan patriarchs, is in many ways innovative and counterintuitive. Both promoted a radical way of seeing the world in which they substituted the particular for the whole, thereby instigating a sharp discrepancy from our ordinary localized and fragmented apprehension of reality. An important point to understand, first of all, is that this particular relationship between Bohm and Huayan does not reveal the phenomenon of wholeness per se. The notion of wholeness, which I identify here with interconnectedness, is already applicable to any of the two fields, independently of the relationship. The purpose of putting them in dialogue lies in emphasizing how a given concept recurs in two contrasted areas of the spectrum of human thought. From there, it may be argued that observing several occurrences of interconnectedness effectively uncovers a principle of wholeness in nature common to various cultures throughout the history of humankind. Huayan represents a distinct development in the history of Buddhism, marked by a clever rewriting of the philosophy of emptiness, shunyata in Sanskrit, of early Mahayana, as a state of interpenetration of all things. Within the Huayan dialectic, this took the form of the 4 dharmadhatus, literally realm of the dharmas. In Chinese, it's called fache, or the ultimate nature of things. Although dharmadhatu is ultimately unified, it is also represented in 4 parts to allow the categorizing and unenlightened analytical mind to elucidate its meaning. The first 2 parts comprise the principle or noumenon of Li, Chinese, and phenomena, shi, as an ontological transmutation of the early Mahayana doctrine of two truths, ultimate and conventional, developed by Nagarjuna. The last parts are the two stages of, I call that non-obstruction or of phenomena against phenomena, shi against shi, and non-obstruction of the principle against phenomena themselves, li against shi. While li represents the principle of emptiness and interdependence, shi is the direct translation of the phenomenal world in all its multifariousness. Far from being disconnected, li and shi form a dyad of complementary concepts, an approximate characterization of a fluctuation between two incessantly interpenetrating levels of reality. The key to this interpenetrative account of the world resides in the two later stages of non-obstruction previously mentioned, as they exemplify how phenomena intermingle to simultaneously partake of the indifferentiated wholeness of li because of their mutual identity, while being plural and dissimilar in shi. The two realities coexist. A good illustration of this whole-part mereological relationship between li and shi can be seen in the metaphor of the golden line, devised by the third and most popular of the Huayan patriarchs, Master Fatsang. In this metaphor, gold is the epitome of the universal and unbounded li, whereas the shape of the line is the representation of shi, of all phenomena, and their nature dynamically intertwine and reflect one another. Fatsang explains the relation between both metaphorical images as follows, I quote, "The gold and the line, whether hidden or manifest, whether one or many, are both pure and mixed, having capacity and lacking it, both this and that. The pattern and events are equally apparent and embrace one another without any obstacles to their firm establishment, even in their most minute details. In every one of the line's eyes, ears, limbs, and joints, and in each and every hair, there is a golden line. Furthermore, the golden line in each and every hair simultaneously enters into any one hair. Consequently, in each and every hair, there are a limitless number of lines. Moreover, each and every hair, which carries this limitless number of lines, also enters into any one hair. In this manner, it is repeated inexhaustibly, like the jewels in Lord Indra's net." Lord Indra's net is another famous metaphor taken from the Avatamsaka Sutra. One can see here how Fatsang renders the complex interwovenness of li and shi by showing how each part is simultaneously different and identical with the whole. According to this metaphysical description of reality, one particular phenomenon includes the whole without omission or need for expansion. The whole of reality is completely contained within each of its individual phenomenal expressions. This is only possible because phenomena are mutually identical in their emptiness. What is the... Sorry, just a second. There we go. On the other side of the spectrum, David Bohm draws holism from his causal interpretation of quantum mechanics. This interpretation was developed in order to remedy the abstruse measurement problem of quantum mechanics, the fact that quantum systems evolve deterministically in superposition of states until a measurement is conducted by the physicists. Bohm supposes that a given particle always has a well-defined position x at all times and is guided by a wave field assumed to be, I quote, an independent actuality that exists on its own, rather than being merely a function from which the statistical properties of phenomena could be derived. This wave field satisfies Schrödinger's equation and in turn determines a quantum potential, denoted Q, that yields classical probabilities for the trajectories of the particle. Due to it being dependent upon the form of the wave and not its intensity, the quantum potential is inherently non-local, which means that it works through interactions at a distance of the type projected by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, i.e. entanglement, and is consequentially necessarily attached to a whole system state, denoted psi, instead of the sum of individual states of the components of a system. For Bohm, these radical novel characteristics of the quantum potential reflect on the need to adopt a reinvented framework to conceptualize the world. I quote, "A new notion of physical reality in which we start from an unbroken wholeness of the totality of the universe." The present language and concomitant worldview used by physicists is indeed improper to characterize reality in light of the striking differences brought by quantum mechanics in comparison with classical physics. What is required is then a complete change of perspective, or in fact a reversal of the classical reductionist way of doing science, in favor of a whole-part mereological relation that is exemplified in the implicate order. In this model, the whole is implicit as an enfolded potential within every single thing, and dynamically unfolds into the explicate order of extended phenomena. The implicate enfolded state of wholeness, akin to a hologram, is made possible due to the non-local character of the quantum potential, whereas the explicate unfolded state of matter gives a certain degree of independence to phenomena. In one of his last papers, Bohm explains the concept as follows, I quote, "The essential feature of this idea was that the whole universe is in some way enfolded in everything, and that each thing is enfolded in the whole. From this, it follows that in some way, and to some degree, everything enfolds or implicates everything else, but in such a manner that under typical conditions of ordinary experience, there is a great deal of relative independence of things. The basic proposal is then that this enfoldment relationship is not merely passive or superficial. Rather, it is active and essential to what each thing is." It appears that although Huayan and Bohm are different on several points, they share an ontological holographic vision of the universe, in which the whole contains the particular and the one encompasses the whole. The two theories, in fact, complement and enhance each other, while the mathematical foundations of the pilot wave interpretation that forms the matrix of the implicate order buttresses the theoretical Lichy framework with the physical and practical representation. The Huayan two realities doctrine supplies the implicate order with an illustrative and imaginative power. Both Bohm and Huayan, the Huayan patriarchs, however, agree on the fact that the ultimate understanding of such holographic principle is inherently intuitive and imaginative. Therefore, one can admittedly infer from this dialogue that there exists a timeless principle of wholeness in nature that is represented in various cultures, whether modern scientific experimental theories or ancient religious and metaphysical ones. Now, what does this tell us about human-animal interactions? The implications of an existing principle of wholeness in nature are far-reaching, extending beyond simple metaphysical speculations. This could indeed in principle affect the entirety of the human modus vivendi and worldview. Thence, it is particularly apropos for the subject of human-animal interactions. Perhaps one of the most problematic and questionable aspects of human-animal relations is that they are usually approached from the sole standpoint of human perception. While this is understandable to an extent, given the unsurpassed complex biological sentience, perchance of a completely other nature, that human beings have reached compared to the rest of the animal kingdom, it demonstrates of a certain deleterious dominion of human stewardship on Earth. The alarming claimed superiority of our adaptable minds over the rest of nature is carried by a dualistic and strongly compartmentalizing spirit between us and the controllable other. This ill-adapted dualistic framework stems from an originally Western mechanistic theoretization process innately characterized by a tendency to dichotomize the inert from the animated, objects from subjects, and in our case, animals from humans. In this context, the only way forward for animal and environmental ethics specialist Lisa Kemmener is to maintain the theoretization and map out new or renewed ethical ways of handling humanimal relations, is for our theories to, I quote, reflect an understanding that we and they, that is the animals, are one. She adds as well, if we are to save ourselves, our planet, and these many individuals, we must see and accept our commonality with all creatures and stop posing theories that begin with an assumption of critical difference. It is believed that the holistic model adduced by Bohm and Huayan Buddhism can help decentralize the I from human beings and promote a much more symbiotic and lateral relationship with animals, an instance of a reciprocal togetherness and in an undifferentiated holistic universe. There seems to be an immediate caveat, however, which needs to be addressed. Such a principle of wholeness does not directly incentivize action. I refer here to the classic Humean is-ought fallacious argument by which there is no logically necessary consequence between an empirical claim and a following normative statement. Noticing a recurring principle of wholeness in nature does not warrant adopting a holistic mindset and acting accordingly. This is further reinforced by the inductive inferential nature of the argument that does not have the same degree of logical consistency or cogency of a deductive argument. However, even if the principle ought us not to take action per se, it still gives sufficient leeway to encourage us to prioritize the whole in lieu of the particular, which may drive actions as a result. The dialogue between Bohm and Huayan holographic thinking therein represents not a completely new ethics, but, I quote, a new moral rearmament, a revival of moral dedication. As Linda Burke recalls in Theorizing Animals, theory matters, and it precisely permits here a reconstruction of the whole as a radical interconnectedness that has mostly sunk into oblivion in our present day and age. In this last short part of the presentation, I wish to briefly outline three shortcomings with this perspective on wholeness. Far from being resolved, these few ideas are simply meant to question the extent of the holistic principle, and I hope that they can open the subsequent Q&A session to fruitful and genuine insights. The first problem is that the theoretical process, even revamped by radical interconnectedness, can scarcely allow for a genuine inner recognition of the oneness shared between animals and humans. The evident sensory perception still presents us with a spatial localization that induces separation between objects. This leads to the second issue. The ontological state of interconnectedness might in fact be different depending on which level of reality one is looking at. Interpenetration might be effective at the implicate level, for example by relating particles together in an enfolded state of reality, but vanishes or becomes hidden at the macroscopic explicate level. The last issue is that up to now, I have been using the concepts of interconnectedness, holism, and interpenetration interchangeably. But despite their close understanding, there are subtle philosophical differences between them which need to be addressed, which is also one of the purposes of my doctoral research. To conclude, I wish to adduce a few powerful and inspiring words from Linda Burke that embody the spirit of interconnectedness that this paper purported to develop. I quote, "Humans, non-humans, ecosystems, all are profoundly entwined and interdependent. Just maybe, out of all this intense debate, we might wake up to the fact that we humans are not alone, that we inhabit this world with an astonishing array of others, whose lives we affect by our actions." Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Allan. Really interesting. I'm going to have to watch it back as part of the chairing. Instead of the time watching the clock. But really interesting. I'll just like to throw it over to
A couple of points. Your last comment there that some of these concepts need to be kind of carefully analyzed and perhaps distinguished. So let's start with the wholeness business. You see the implicate order. Is there anything new that we are adding to what the ancient philosophers used to refer to when they said being is the shared, as it were, category, the way we think of things. Everything that exists enjoys being. So there is some kind of unity.
Yeah.
And then everything is in an essentially specific way. That's the essence. So they had a way of doing these things, perhaps. So my first question is whether you are aware of any as it were, novelty in the way we use the word wholeness in this context. Even animals, for instance, we say the way we use it nowadays is not completely helpful, because we say humans and animals. But the traditional way was you had the human animals, the rational animals, and the non-rational animals.
Yeah.
We're both animals. Animals means animated. You see, they move instead of like, and unlike this chair.
Yeah.
So there was a recognition of the generic aspect which we share, and then the specificity of each.
Yeah.
So I just wanted, perhaps you could situate it with respect to these kind of more classic concepts of unity between things.
Very good question. It gets tricky because if you try to differentiate the concepts philosophically, it's obviously more difficult than in an experiential way, i.e. meditative in the case of Buddhism. Because Master Fat Seng, for example, in his sources would say that ultimately that experience of wholeness requires a meditative approach, you know, like you cannot just approach it from the rational point of view. And so you have this feeling of wholeness, which is also to an extent a unity, as you mentioned. I'm not sure to what extent Bohm would agree with that, because in my understanding of Bohm, wholeness is not a unity per se. We're not saying that everything is united, is just one. That's why we use the term wholeness, otherwise we would use unity. Regarding more specifically what you said, I think that harkens back to the whole ideas developed by Friedrich Capra in the 70s, you know, the Tao of Physics and that stuff, if you know about it, in which he effectively tried to establish that ancient philosophies and modern science were saying the same thing. It's a bit more complex than that. I think that one can find similar approaches, similar ideas, which is in itself should be questioned, you know. I remember one reviewer of a scientist of Capra's book when he hit the shelves in the 70s, who said that those common ideas only represent basic tendencies of the human mind. Even if that's the case, it ought to be questioned. And it doesn't mean, for all that, that everything is similar and that we throw all the theories in the same bucket, if you will. So that's where you need philosophy to carefully differentiate the different worldviews. And it's even more complicated because there are obvious differences. One of them, for example, is that in Bohm, the quantum potential is holistic in the philosophical sense of the term. That is that it's the whole idea of entanglement in mathematics. The system, the state of the whole system, let's say a table or a human body, is inherently composed of something special that does not appear if you just take the sums of the individual components of the system. That approach is not effective in Huayan Buddhism, because Fat Seng clearly says in his sources again that the whole is merely the sum of its parts. So philosophically you have an inconsistency here. The question as to whether that prevents establishing a common idea regarding reality, that's, I don't know how I would need to go about that to, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Just a preliminary question and something perhaps a bit deeper. The preliminary question is, did Bohm know about Huayan philosophy?
Good question.
Is he influenced by that?
Yeah.
That's just a preliminary question. The second thing is, what are the driving forces that prevent so many people from accepting this kind of holism? Because it simply remains unpopular. And I'm thinking back, actually, to the 19th century, when there's a real tension between Darwinian evolution, which is new on the block, as it were, and a traditional Christianity which sets humans and animals almost into two different categories. And Darwin says, and it partially explains the clerical resistance, I think, famous entry in his notebook, we are all netted together. And that's the animals as well as humans. And that's dangerous at the time that is articulated. So I can understand the resistance then, because it was a break. But now, what's the driver behind the resistance?
Okay. Well, for the second question, I'm only going to be speculating because I'm not sure exactly. I would say that, in my understanding, probably the extremely consumerist and mechanistic worldview in which we've evolved for the last decades, if not centuries, plays a good part. Because people are actually convinced in their everyday lives that they are separated and that, like, their desires and everything is driven by the outside world, which instigates separation between them and the other. So the problem then again is that our sensory perception of that is separation and fragmentation, and Bohm notices it as well. So how should we go to embrace that holism? I don't know. Good question. I think, like, if you rely on quantum mechanics and entanglement, like, that could provide you something a bit more practical to recognize the principle, although you would still need to acknowledge how you would pass from the quantum to the macroscopic realm, for example, with decoherence aspects and all of that. But I suspect that you might also need something more of an experiential nature, like a meditative experiment, or, I don't know, mystical experience like Christians have had over the centuries, something that actually gets you out of your ordinary perception of the world into something more entwined. So yes, that would be my answer to the second question. I forgot the first one.
The first one was, did Bohm know the details of the community?
So actually Bohm was in conversation with Jiddu Krishnamurti back in the 70s, 80s, who was an Indian philosopher, the head of the Theosophical Society, which was especially popular back in the 19th century. It's very Orientalist and New Age, obviously, but Krishnamurti was definitely an Indian, spreading Vedanta in the Western world. And he was really interested in his theories. They were actually, I think, in conversation in Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken, back in the day. So whether he was actually knew about Huayan precisely, I'm not sure, because Krishnamurti was really versed into Vedanta. But at the same time, the Vedantic philosophy of Hinduism is quite close to Buddhism. There are doctrinal differences, but they are, in my opinion, probably closer than the branches of Christianity, for instance, So it's difficult to say exactly whether he knew about Huayan. He definitely knew about Chinese philosophy in the form of Taoism, which is probably the most recognized one. Maybe not Huayan specifically.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we're going to have to, I'm sorry to everyone, but I would suggest Louis and Anna do catch up. After the new papers, we've got a chance to have coffee and catch up. But thank you so much, Allan.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. We may be small in number, but we very much appreciated what you had to say. So
thank you.
Another